welcome to the show, Dan.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Can you tell us a bit about your career journey and what got you interested in games, but specifically games for impact?
Sure. Well, apropos to the theme of this particular podcast, I was actually at a crossroads at a pivotal moment in my early career where I was either going to go into educational games or into renewable energy, because I was super excited about both, and both were burgeoning frontier spaces. And I had a very difficult time making the decision, but ultimately, obviously, decided to go toward learning games. And that started with quite a ways before founding Filament, started with just a general interest in a belief in the power of the medium of games to do more than just entertain, basically. Not even necessarily to have a positive impact in specific, but just to do more than entertain. And out of that grew an interest in the idea of utilizing video games as a tool for learning, just because I love personally learning stuff. I have a voracious appetite for learning new things. And so many of the experiences that I had in life as a learner, as a lifelong learner, were things that involved getting my hands on and experiencing them firsthand. So that experiential learning aspect. It occurred to me that a lot of those experiences could essentially be replicated through the technology of video games. So I went to do a master's degree in education technology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and was just over the moon fortunate to study under some of the seminal researchers in the learning game space: James Paul G., Constance Steinkuhler, Kurt Squire, Rich Halverson, folks of that nature. And there was this critical mass of people at the University of Wisconsin-Madison at the time, faculty who were writing about learning games. And I wanted to put some of that rhetoric into practice. So I ended up being more of like a project-oriented master's student as opposed to a research-oriented master's student. And out of that first project, which was a game about ocean science, where you play the role of a scientist on an alien planet trying to understand how the ecosystem works so that you can determine what the environmental impact of a crashed fertilizer carrying spaceship would be. We got the first funding for the company in order to officially found the company. So our roots were, as an organization, very much in the environmental gaming space, if you want to call it that, with that first project that ended up being a project that we did with National Geographic around ocean science.
Wow. So your kind of like primary place that you were coming from was from really started environmentally rather than started with games. So have you done anything with renewable energy, like in your own house or your own community or work?
Yeah.
Have you got any solar panels, electric car, anything like that going on? Rewired?
Yeah, tragically, I've been trying to put solar panels on my house for years, and every company I have come out and quote it keeps telling me that I don't get enough sun because of some big, gorgeous trees that block all of my light, and I'm not willing to cut down. So instead, I just keep it freezing cold in my house, as you can tell from my layers of winter clothing here. So that's one thing. My partners and I also share a communal space at a country home about an hour away from Madison, and that's all decked out with solar panels. Our energy bill last month was, I think, $10 because everything else was fueled by the solar panels. And I'm a big fan of all the tools. So we have, electric mower, electric chainsaw, et cetera, et cetera. And it's so cool to be able to power all those things off of the sun. Besides that, I'm a bus, bike, walker kind of guy. Madison's a really friendly town for that. We have a good metro system. It's an isthmus, so that helps with the metro layout. And then we have a really good bike trail network. And I also live pretty close to downtown, so most of the places that I want to buy groceries or hardware stores, things of that nature, I don't have to go more than a mile to get 90% of the things that I need. And I'm also a backyard gardener. So I try to grow as much food as I possibly can, as close as I possibly can. The stuff that I can't grow in my backyard, I get from a co-op up the street that sources most of the produce locally here in Wisconsin. I'm a Wisconsin transplant, but this is a great place to be for eating local and eating organic.
Well, that's cool that you've been able to put at least some of it into practice in the real hardware. Because I think it's easy when you do a lot of content or game design or experience design to end up in the world of just kind of like content and theory and not so much in the real practical world of putting it in. I'm secretly jealous of all the people who do real energy efficiency work crawling through buildings and stuff, because I feel like I'm always leaning too much into the creative and the theoretical world. But I wanted to ask you to just dive in and extract some of your wisdom about how to actually put these games and these experiences together. Can you go over the design framework or process that you go through when you have like a new concept and a new client and it's totally fresh and new? What system do you go through to build the concept out?
Sure. It's a little bit different from one project to the next, but in broad strokes, we always begin with a set of learning objectives. So what are the things that we want to teach? What's the impact that we want to have? How do we want the user to be impacted by this game experience? And then we design out essentially a set of hypotheses about how a set of game mechanics could have that impact. And then how will we test that on the other side to see whether or not it is actually having that impact? So once we have the broad strokes learning objectives and a set of game mechanics that we think could teach those things, then we essentially start prototyping. We do concept work and create out flesh out a design document and things like that. This is all kind of discovery phase stuff where we try to get a rough sense of what it is we're going to build without committing too many lines of code or creating too many final art assets before we're really sure that we're headed in the right direction. And then from there, it's a pretty straightforward process of going to an alpha, beta, and then finally a gold through the process of 2-week sprints, where in each sprint we set out an objective in terms of the mechanics that we want to develop in that sprint, and then how we want to test those mechanics on the other side. And then with game development in general, but I think in particular for impact-oriented games, there's always pivots along the way as you learn more about how well those mechanics work in practice. And that's because I think compared to other genres of gameplay, we're not able to draw as much from convention or precedent. If you're making a first-person shooter, there are hundreds and hundreds of first-person shooters that you're going to be drawing inspiration from, and you're probably not going to reinvent the formula. You're probably going to make some tweaks. Whereas with impact games, oftentimes we draw inspiration from many, many different genres at once, or no genres. We invent something totally new and quirky and go off the reservation.
I think it's really interesting. You bring up this idea of this hypothesis and this evidence and this testing. And I find that, what I find is really missing from the impact space largely, I wouldn't say it's completely missing, but I think it's quite weak in a lot of our design thinking, is this idea of causality, that we actually know what the hypothesis is we're testing, and then what the causal mechanism is for testing that. And I talk about causality a lot and bringing causality and creativity together, which I feel like sounds like mumbo jumbo, like for most people when I first say it. But I think you'd understand what I'm saying. You'll have this hypothesis that we expect this thing to happen. If people see this particular thing, then they'll do that action or they'll learn this thing. And there's a few different ways we can go about that. And then when you figure out what that causal mechanism is, like it could be comparison, or it could be journey, or it could be some social identity, or whatever it is, once you know what it is, like right from its theoretical skeleton, then you can apply like a creative layer over the top. Then you can make it fun, make it colorful, make cool characters. But it's based on this core mechanism that you know what works.
I'm of two minds with that. I think one is, based on what I said before and our methodology, I think it's the best way to go about making games for impact. On the other hand, there is what I'll describe as maybe a cautionary perspective, which is that I think when we make games for educational impact in specific, there can sometimes be an obsession with the idea that something needs to have evidence-based positive impact before it can be considered of value. And we hold games to perhaps an unfair standard compared to other more accepted, more traditional media, like say books, for example. Nobody really asks all that much whether or not books work, but obviously we use them day in and day out and have for centuries. Whereas when something's new, there's this kind of question of whether or not you can prove that it works. And I think one of the cool things about games, but also one of the things that makes them maddeningly difficult to answer the question, can you prove that it works, is that they are experiences. Video games are experience engines. It's not flat content. With flat content, I can communicate that content, whether it's through a video or a passage of text or a picture, and I can ask you to recite it back to me. And if you can recite it back to me, whether that's through a multiple choice test or just verbally, then I have evidence that you have internalized that flat content. Having people parrot back concepts or experience-based knowledge, cognition that is embedded inherently in the performance of a concept or a skill or a task, is much less straightforward, right? So if somebody were to design a video game to teach me to be a better entrepreneur, if I were to say, I'm not going to use that video game until you can prove to me that it's going to make me a better entrepreneur, okay, well, then that game developer is burdened with the task of proving that their video game has had a positive impact on your entrepreneurship abilities, which then by logical extension means that you have to figure out how you measure what it means to be a better or worse entrepreneur. And of course, we all know that being a good entrepreneur doesn't boil down to a list of simple do this, do that, if then kind of skills, right? There's a lot of nuance to it. There's a lot of intuition to it. It's very dynamic. It's a very dynamic content space. So I think we should always be pushing to have more evidence-based game design, while at the same time offering ourselves some grace in terms of the acceptance of video games as a technology for positive impact, which is to say that we should use them without holding them to a standard that we don't hold other forms of media to, just because they are teaching things that are inherently complex and thus inherently difficult to measure.
And also the lens that I come through, which is a much more kind of simple form of, although I don't call myself a game designer, it's really looking at, I call it action design. My job is perhaps, say if you and I were working on the same project, my job would be, how do I get people to put their banana peel in the compost? So I'm very much focused on the real world action and kind of like drawing from game design. Whereas you might create a game that teaches people all about what compost is and what it's about. Yes. And these are still both really important parts. And so what I was thinking about as you were talking was that we need to encourage intrinsic motivation in people. There's kind of like action design stuff, like getting people to put a smiley face when they do something like every day and using colors and feedback loops and that kind of in the real world stuff. It works much better on people that have high levels of intrinsic motivation. All of this behavior design works kind of on everybody, whether you're into environmental stuff or not. But the people that are really, really high, they have high levels of education, high levels of knowledge, high levels of emotional motivation. They're very, very easy to get to do the action. It will be very, very sticky on them. So if you're just totally just coming through an action design lens or being too reductive in this evidence-based approach, perhaps you might be losing a little bit of the nuance of how we encourage this inner emotional and psychic garden in people that makes them attuned to these behaviors. And all of these things are long-term. You can't necessarily put in a box someone's entire childhood and adolescence and how they came to becoming a really self-aware, impactful person that they might have gone on to study environmental engineering or environmental science or gone into renewable energy. There's been at least a decade of ambient input into someone's psyche that's made them predispositioned to be a pro-environmental person. And also there's a little bit of a funnel, kind of like a sales funnel or a behavior funnel with this stuff. And if you're putting people through the funnel, I think a lot of people mix up where their experience or their idea or their game or whatever it is they do, where it fits on the funnel. And I see the funnel as having 3 phases. You've got the one that attracts attention. So the game might be something that really just attracts attention to the cause. Like it could be something very simple. It could be something that's very fancy, like some augmented reality experience, something that's out publicly, something that's just very fun and very novel to attract attention. But its job isn't to actually create the behavior. It's just there to attract the attention. Or it could be some of like a deeper emotional relationship building. Like if somebody's playing the game about compost, they're having this emotional, sticky experience. And then what we actually want the person to do at the end, which is to buy the product or change the behavior, that's a different realm. That's the bit I would do. That, okay, we've basically grabbed their attention. We've created this deep level of engagement. Now we want to have the action to happen. And you kind of have to be measuring it for different things along different stages of this funnel.
Mm. Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think there's, particularly when you're talking about longitudinal change as opposed to something short term, it's really important that the player or the whoever you're trying to impact is engaging and then re-engaging. We see this in, for example, professional development with educators. There's a lot of evidence at this point that one-off professional development doesn't stick. It doesn't have a lasting impact. You need to be re-engaging with the educators throughout the semester and ideally throughout the year. And that's one of the things that I, again, think is great about games. I can't tell you how many deeply moving and impactful documentary films that I've watched that got me fired up about a particular subject matter for some relatively short period of time before it faded beyond the periphery of my temporal sphere of awareness, right? Whereas games can engage, get you fired up, and then give you reason to come back and re-engage over and over and over again across a long period of time. And as we know, with the formation of any kind of habit or the formation or change in behavior, those things are really driven by practice, essentially. And that the brain is wired to, the brain needs to rewire itself before those things will really stick. And the way that rewiring happens is through continual longitudinal engagement and practice. So that's one area where I think games can really shine in that respect.
I'd never thought about it that way, is that often these experiences are batch things. It's like COP27. It's a batch, it's a conference, it's a documentary, it's a singular thing, rather than really looking at what is a system, any kind of system or any kind of creation that's going to keep people engaged over the long term. I mean, laws, policy, buildings, architecture, everything happens over a long time. So if it's just going to be like a one-off batch process, it's only going to have that short-term impact.
No, 100%. The best, I feel like the most salient analogy that everybody can relate to is the idea of friendship. If you have somebody, maybe you met somebody, you had an amazing experience, you exchange numbers, you're like, I want this person to be my new best friend. And then, a couple of weeks pass and that connection fades and you don't feel you don't have the same feelings. Whereas if you say share a hobby with that person, you see them every other Tuesday to play tennis or whatever, and you have that ongoing connection and reinforcement of that relationship, now that friendship can develop into something that will last the test of time. And that just seems to, whether you're talking about social engagement or something educational or something behavior change oriented or something habit oriented, it just seems like as animals, we we really need to have reasons outside of ourselves to keep doing the same thing over and over and over again across a long period of time before it's actually going to become a meaningful part of our lives. And that's, I feel like anytime you're talking about impact, if something doesn't become a meaningful part of the person's life, if it's an ad hoc one-off intervention, then you're just not going to get the impact that is ultimately desired, because most of the time real change requires long-term stick-to-itness, right?
Yeah. It just reminded me of this one phrase I've been putting out into my trainings more, which is build a movement, not a product. Because people come to me all the time with their ideas. They're like, I'm trying to make a game, I'm trying to make a startup, or I've got this physical product, or I'm putting on this. And they're so caught up in the idea or the product, whether it's a digital thing or like a physical product or a campaign or whatever, and that it's this finite thing they're trying to release into the world. And I tell them, like, it doesn't matter what your idea is. For a start, you haven't built it yet, so it could change. And you really want to build a movement of people. You don't even need a product to build a movement. You can get people together, you can get people taking action. You can just do it with Zoom and with Slack or with Discord and just have a vision. And once you've got a group of people together with a vision that is fine with that, they're identifying with this mission. You can put any product in that. It can be anything at all, but it's really taking this long-term community building perspective on what you're trying to make. It's more about the movement of the people than it is about the actual widget or thing or game, that you put out into the world.
Totally agree. Yeah.
I wrote down a bunch of game mechanics that I wanted to ask you what you thought was the thing that you really want to get right. But then I thought, what's the really thing that you want to avoid, like the big mistake? So I'll run through them. I don't think it's a comprehensive list because,
Oh, fun.
like I said, I have more of a behavior than a game designer. But the first one is story, like the hero's journey, the story arc of the game. What's the thing that you really want to let people know? If there's one thing you want to get right, what is it? And the one mistake that you want to not do?
In developing a story. See, that's a tricky one because we actually don't do a lot of narrative-based game development. It's actually more the exception than the rule. But if we were to do a heavily narrative-driven game experience, I think the one thing that you want to get right is the ending. You want to stick the ending. That's the part that will stick with people. And for whatever, this is how we're trained, right? Through contemporary media, we're trained to place all of our eggs in the ending basket. People who religiously watch certain shows on TV might watch them for 4, 5, 6 seasons, dedicating hundreds of the hours of their lives to it. And if they don't nail the ending, then they walk away with a sour/bitter taste in their mouth.
Game of Thrones.
That's the one I was going to mention. Yeah, exactly like Game of Thrones. And you see this in games too. One example that comes to mind is there's a sci-fi space game series that was heavily narratively driven RPG that had, I think there were up to maybe 3 or 4 instantiations of the game. So by this point, players have invested hundreds of hours, and then it's almost like every hour that was invested makes the person that much saltier when they don't like how the experience concludes. So that's what I would make sure you get right. In terms of, and then what's the other side? Things to not do, things to avoid.
Yeah, I mean, it could be just the same kind of thing, but
right.
But sometimes it's different. Like the thing that you want to get right and the thing you want to avoid are not necessarily the same thing.
I think the thing to avoid for narrative is being too self-indulgent. I think there's a lot of people who write narrative or write dialogue to build out narrative that spend a lot of time on building out things that ultimately aren't serving the narrative in any kind of really important or meaningful way. If somebody's going to tell me a story, I want them to hit the important beats, and I want everything. I don't want a bunch of, proverbial side quests, if you will. I don't want a bunch of forced character development dialogue. I don't want a bunch of just kind of filler, basically. I feel like the best stories get in, and then they deliver those great story beats, and then they get out.
Okay, what about novelty? Novelty gets used a lot in neuroscience and behavioral psychology. It's a big part of game design too, to keep people's attention. What's the most important thing to get right with this dimension?
With novelty, so novelty is, I think, an incredibly powerful game mechanic in general, and is what, interestingly, I think a lot of people seek when they play games, because they're, by virtue of the fact that they're playing a game, they're seeking out an experience that they probably can't really have easily in the real world, or maybe at all. But on the other hand, people also want things that feel familiar. There's a great TED Talk on this. I think it's called How to Sell Anything. And the basic premise is that people crave novelty, but at the same time, ironically, we crave familiarity. And so some of the most successful games or books or movies are things that offer something a little bit new, but in a kind of a familiar context or a familiar package. I would say the thing to not do with novelty is to overdo it, right? Because people do still have that interest in connecting with something that feels familiar or nostalgic in some way. The thing to do with novelty is, 100%. I think including being very intentional about designing novelty into your experience is absolutely essential, particularly coming from the perspective of the game industry at large and somebody who advocates for the game industry to grow and mature. I mean, this is easy for me to say because I'm not a game publisher putting, tens of millions of dollars on the line to develop a new AAA title that is not based on an existing franchise or an existing set of game mechanics that have proven successful, like a Call of Duty. But our space is just, our industry is in desperate need of people having the courage to try new things and to build novelty into their games, both in terms of game mechanics, games that aren't just about violence, for example, or in terms of topics and themes, games that explore things other than conflict or battle, et cetera, et cetera.
We're talking about novelty, fairly abstract. Can you be a bit more specific by what you think when you're looking at like, okay, how do I perhaps turn up the volume on the novelty of this concept? What would you be looking to do?
Well, basically, I'm thinking of it as a game mechanic that asks me to do something that I haven't done previously in a game. So a good example of this is the game Papers, Please. This is a game where you are playing as somebody who's checking passports at an immigration checkpoint. I don't know that I necessarily want to do that for fun, but I love that this game exists. And I love that there's a game that asks people to do that for fun. Or maybe fun's the wrong word, that asks people to do that as a meaningful experience. I would like to see more games that ask people to do things that they're not used to doing in games in the pursuit of meaning.
Because when I asked you the question, I was totally not thinking it like that at all. When I think of novelty, I think completely visually. I'm like a color that's novel, like a little sparkly thing that's novel, like something bounces in a novel way. Also, with a lot of sustainability stuff, I think we are painfully bad at novelty. Stuff still is looking like corporate documents and everything's green and brown and it's got a picture of a tree and it's an earth. And I'm just like, make a little pink monster that jumps around that has 3 eyes. Like it doesn't all be, trees. And I like trees and lakes, but it kind of starts to all look like that.
That's a great point. I mean, in terms of visual novelty, it's something that, as a cautionary tale, we recently released this game Roboco, which is a pretty hardcore engineering / robotics experience. At its core, if you really want to get into it, you can make a non-slip differential gear setup if you want to, or you can just make a silly robot that can deliver a sandwich. But the aesthetic treatment of the game is very fun and playful and silly and almost kind of youthful in its affect. I think the visual novelty kind of belies the depth. The depth of the engineering experience under the surface. And I think for a lot of people, that is a surprise. For some of them, I think it's a good surprise. For some of them, it's not a good surprise. So people are trained to read the book by its cover. And I think whenever we're designing games or any media, we have to make a very conscious decision about whether or not we want to do something novel, understanding that the inherent risk is that we're going to delight some people and other people are going to find themselves having an experience or in a genre that they want nothing to do with.
Right. But I've never thought of novelty and branching in terms of like a novel function and a visual that you pair it off, that it can be in these different realms. Another thing that I think is really interesting is levels. And like level design is a super common everyday part of what you do as a game designer. But when I'm in my world as a behavior designer, the idea that you would design for environmental behaviors at people's different levels. For example, if you've got a group of vegans, you are going to be designing something very different for them than if you've got people who are in the half and half meat vegetarian, or the people that just hate vegetarians, hate vegetables. That you've got people at different levels, and they're perhaps at their different levels of skills of where they're at with their environmental behaviors, their consciousness, their engagement. And that's an extremely novel way to approach it. It's not in the zeitgeist of climate action design thinking to bring that in. So what can you share with us about when you're looking into level design and how to design levels that you think we can draw from when we're trying to get people to do stuff in the real world?
Now, this is another one of those things that we should semantically clear up. So do you mean levels in terms of the player's level of experience, or do you mean levels in almost like chapters of a book, like levels that have different gameplay mechanics or levels that increase in complexity over the course of a game experience, or levels that just explore different themes is another way to think about it?
I was just thinking of it in terms of as you just move through something, you start at level 1 and then you move to level 2 and you just progress as you go. You don't give people everything at once. Everybody starts at level 1 and then they have to go up from there.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Because in one sense, you can think of the purpose of leveling as a scaffolding progression, right? So it's designed to make it so that the player has as smooth as possible on-ramp into learning your game and how to be good at your game and how to succeed at your game. The other way you can think of it is it's just a going back to the novelty thing, each level is a way to change up the scenery, change up the game mechanics in such a way that keeps the player engaged, because now they're doing something different that they weren't doing in the previous levels. And I think both of those ways of approaching level design have utility. And then the third way is that you chunk up the content into chapters like a book and just make it that much more digestible. You give the player logical opportunities to say, okay, maybe I'm done for now, and I'll come back when I'm refreshed. There's a natural arc in the experience that has a climax and then a denouement and then maybe a pause, and then they come back and do it again at a later date in a new level. I think all three of those are great reasons to divide content out that way. A lot of our games have levels in them, certainly not all of them. The downside of designing games with levels, particularly if you're on a budget, is that as soon as you have levels, there's an expectation that there be at least so many, right? Nobody would write a 2-chapter book. That would feel really weird. So I think, yeah, the levels are a terrific tool for framing the experience around, for scaffolding the progression of the player, but that come with the necessary caveat that I think if you had less than like 6 levels in a game, that might feel weird. That feels like an arbitrary threshold, but that's the number I'm picking.
I've broken plenty of stuff down into just 3 because, I'm often dealing with the simpler stuff. But that's cool. I hadn't ever thought about it before as a way of just introducing novelty to just change up the scenery, change up the characters and stuff. And a lot of what I've found myself doing professionally and just in my own work is teasing out these enormous amounts of environmental actions into interactive experiences that people can digest. One of the jobs I got was from the United Nations that had this 100-page PDF document with basically every single thing that you could possibly do to regenerate the planet and regenerate ecosystems. And it was everything from like eat less meat to get $5 million worth of funding and get a team of people to recreate a coral reef. Stuff that's like super simple everyday things to really, really advanced. And it was all jumbled together, like literally in the same sentences. So I just spent the time just like copying and pasting it out. And I put it into 3 levels, did it for them because I had to try to make something really simple and interactive and tried to tease it out. But it was just a process of just trying to get these huge amount of actions just segmented, like you said, like chapters. And it's this problem that we have so much. We're doing anything environmental. It is a lot of actions, but you can't give people lots of actions at once. Like wear a hoodie, keep your thermostat down, grow vegetable gardens. And there's honestly there's hundreds. Like, where do you even start? And so there's levels as a way to kind of like break it up. But I hadn't thought of this idea of creating the change and the novelty. I was thinking about it in a way of like, let's get to 5 things, give people a, like a thumbs up or a check, and then give that reward system, almost like showing people along a progress bar that they can at least make it through 5 little chunks of content or 5 little actions, things that are learning. And then they come to an end and then they get the like, good job, confetti reward system. And then that's kind of like a chapter, but it's a way of just tickling that reward system and that tracking of progress. So it's not just like, oh my God, there's a heap of like hundreds of things I just can't compute. But that's something that's a bit more specific to the actions rather than the education. But another one I've got here is these reward systems. What are your thoughts when you're trying to think of how to design these rewards? Rewards can be just like little animations, little good jobs, a sense of completion. What do you work with to try to make these good?
There's a lot of different types of rewards that we use in games. I think we try, whenever possible, we try to tie them to the game mechanics as intrinsically as possible. So the game mechanic itself is also the reward. The thing that we're asking you to do is in and of itself the reward. So for example, in Roboco, we're asking you to build a robot that can solve a challenge. And the reward is, for sure, the most gratifying reward is solving the challenge itself, having that moment where you're like, wow, I just built a thing that can cross a gap and turn a valve. And I went through like 6 levels of iteration or 6, instances of iteration on this design. And the final one does it, and it does it elegantly, and it works just like I had hoped. That feels amazing because the player is excited about intrinsically excited about their accomplishment. But of course, on top of that, we also say, good job, you unlocked some new cosmetics for your robot. Good job, you unlocked the next level. You got some bits or currency that you can spend on different things in the experience. And so we're tapping into some of those different dopamine systems. But there's no doubt about it that the satisfaction or the gratification that stems from the actual completion of the task in the game is the thing that we want to lean on the heaviest, because that's the thing that's actually going to produce long-term change for that person.
That's kind of in the realm of mastery when you're thinking about game design, isn't it? You're trying to encourage mastery of the topic and the intrinsic motivation of the mastery, rather than somebody wants to do it because they want to get the strawberry to bounce up and down at the end.
That's right. That's right. Yep, exactly. And those types of those smaller, extrinsically motivating rewards are still nice. I think those have a place, and I think that they produce the desired effect. It's just not as, how do I say, it doesn't last as long, right? It wears off relatively quickly versus a reward that is tied to the player's sense of self-efficacy.
Can you talk a bit more about the intrinsic desire that we have for mastery? Because something that comes up a lot in the environment and climate is the general worldview that people are completely self-interested, and the only way to motivate them is with money and with the law. You have to make it illegal or make it cheaper.
Right.
And everybody wants it to be really simple. It has to be simple, it has to be easy, it has to be free. And that's probably true for the less involved people, but I find it far more fascinating and interesting to look at how enormously motivated humans can be to do really complex stuff that they don't have to do, like chess grand championships. Like there's all these people that go off Niagara Falls in a barrel. Mm-hmm. And there's this one woman that did it in the 1800s and she survived, like breaking the 4-minute mile. Like the guy Felix, who jumped out of the spaceship and he parachuted to Earth. All over the world, people are pursuing their mastery of doing something that's never been done before, of unraveling some complex puzzle. And I think that's a far more interesting and powerful thing to try to tap into than this idea that we're all just kind of like animals on a farm, and you've just got to put the food over there and then all the animals will walk this way. It might be true for some of the population, obviously that's happening. But what are your thoughts on this powerful capacity for this obsession with mastery that humans have in us, and how we can tap into that, with games?
Yeah, I do think it's universal. I think everybody has the capacity to derive deep pleasure and satisfaction from mastering something, and in particular, mastering something that is challenging. If it's not challenging, I would say the level of satisfaction and pleasure oftentimes is one-to-one with how challenging it is to master the thing. What I think is hard, well, hard's an understatement. What is extremely elusive is how you get somebody to care about the thing you want them to master, as opposed to the thing that they've already kind of organically decided on their own that they want to master. The cool thing about the list that you just put forward is that, all of those things are wildly different pursuits. And, what is it about one brain that really wants to jump out of a plane in space in parachute to the ground versus another brain that wants to explore something previously unexplored versus another one that wants to, dive to the deepest depth and see how long they can hold their breath, or learn a new instrument or whatever, whatever the thing is. Once somebody has committed to the idea of mastering something, then we can create games that keep them engaged longer than perhaps they would be on their own. But creating a game that can take somebody from having no interest in mastering something to having interest in a mastery in something, now that's the golden ticket right there, right? And I know that we can do that. We certainly have done that. We've created games that I think have successfully done that for people. I've had that same experience playing video games myself, but I don't know what the formula is. And if anybody were ever able to figure, the reliable formula to take somebody who has no interest in X, and then on the other side of that experience, they're deeply passionate about becoming a master of X, I don't know how to make that a formula, but I do know that games can help.
Well, I suppose writing my book, and recently I've put my book into this little, I've actually got it right here, this little behavior card kit. Can you see it? Has it come up on my Zoom background?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I put all the game and behavior design techniques in this little card kit, trying to put it in a box the best I can that people can try to solve that. But I think all of us who are really deeply into sustainability, I mean, that's our quest. I mean, we kind of say it's for the earth, but I feel like personally, like I'm so far beyond it being about the planet. For me, an obsession with mastery. How do I turn 100 people who don't really care into these like rabid environmental enthusiasts? You know, I get to practice these things on people and be like, hey, do you know that you're doing 20% worse than your neighbors? And just watch their result. They're like, oh my God. And just looking at all the little interactions that people have. Like one guy, I tested out an app I made. He puts his fist in the air and he was like he was so upset that he was low on the leaderboard, and this feeling of rage and competition. And he wasn't really trying to be funny. He really meant it. He was like, oh, like I want at getting my carbon emissions down. But we're all in the game of mastering this earth-centric way of life. All of us who do it professionally, we do it in our private lives. And I don't hear about it talked about it that way. Like, how do you complete a completely zero emissions house or a zero emissions community, or get my house to be zero waste, to live, you know, without any plastic? All the people that are really diehard don't ever use plastic. Have you ever done it before, where you don't use any packaging, nothing in a can, nothing plastic?
Like I said with the documentary, I remember watching a YouTube video about somebody who went zero waste for some period of time. It was really inspiring. I was like, oh, cool, I'm going to do that. And then, you know, I did it for a month, and then life happened. And so there was that gravitational pull back to the norm.
It's a particularly hard one to do because the world is really, really not built for it. But I think the pursuit of, say, zero waste living, which is probably one of the hardest things to do, I think if you see that through the lens of mastery, and if that's something you're trying to promote with people, talking about it, designing it, just looking at everything that you do in that space through mastery, is like a really, really different lens to promote it and to think about it than like the fish in the ocean have plastic in them. Okay, I know fish in the ocean have plastic in them, but I'm not personally littering. It doesn't, I don't know, I think it kind of wears off the environmental lens, the environmental call to action wears off, and the self-mastery, I think, is just personally, I sense that it's far more powerful.
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, that again, that concept of self-efficacy, I think, is just super, super powerful because it feels really good. That's like the ultimate dopamine hit, is to be like, yeah, I'm capable. And I set my mind to do a thing and it was hard, and then I did it anyway. Feels just absolutely incredible. But I think with a lot of these, whether you're trying to reduce your waste or reduce your CO2 footprint or whatever it is, I again come back to this idea of habits, because I think that's where the rubber really meets the road. It's not particularly difficult to get psyched up on something and do it for a short period of time before you abandon ship. But to have something become a new permanent way of life is a really big deal. And that's where, at least in my experience, the purpose of the type of work that we do, I think, is to prime the pump and get somebody to the mental place they need to be at in order to be ready to commit to some long-term behavior change like that. And of course, it can play a role in helping actually create the behavior change in and of itself as well. But it's hard to say which one is more important, and maybe they're equally important, but I think games can play a role in both the mindset shift, or priming the pump, or getting the person passionate about an idea or excited about an idea or ready to learn more or ready to pursue mastery. And they can also be the rungs of the ladder that help that person get from the ground to a point of mastery. And I suppose the best combination would be the 1-2 punch of both. I don't know that I've seen very many instances of games that try to do both, but it seems like both are necessary in order for that change to be longitudinal.
I think it's really, really exciting to think about the game design context and the pursuit of trying to, almost like it's like an Easter egg inside someone that you can crack open, that obsession with that mastery over a thing, and thinking like, can I hatch that open with someone? Not like, how can I enable people to be more lazy and care less through making it so easy no one has to care. I mean, hopefully we get to that eventually, but I find that deep kind of soul-driven, salivating passion to open up in people is the most exciting. I did this little diagram about a year ago that was like a staircase. The more experts I talk to in this space, people that do, their PhDs in the social science of change, and then there's people like you who are designing these interactive experiences. It's kind of like a staircase. The first one is attitude. You need to get people to just have a pro-environmental attitude. Before any behavior comes or before anything else happens, people are psychologically primed. And that word that you use to prime, I mean, that's also a word that's used in the psychological literature, which is like priming, prime people. So when they have the opportunity to take the action, they're ready to go.
Sure.
And so there's a huge investment in getting people psychologically to have a high pro-environmental attitude. And most people actually do have a reasonably high one. And then you can move into behavior. Like, is that actually then going into your behavior? And these first two steps, it kind of feels like that's where the kind of industry kind of stops. Here's the education, here's the behavior. But then I saw all these other rungs on that. I'm like, well, the next one is kind of like social influence. Like, you're getting your friends and family involved. You're reaching out. You're starting to become an entrepreneur. Maybe you want to start a business. And then there's a level of mastery. Do you actually really try to master something like green walls? Do you spend 30 years trying to re-engineer green walls to be able to work on 30-story high buildings and figure out the watering systems? All of the environmental stuff that we see today is built upon the backbone of people spending decades obsessively mastering whatever it is they do. If it's how to, keep solar panels clean because they get dirty on roofs, all these different types of green infrastructure that you can put on buildings, just even like drainage systems. So you don't need to use concrete, you can use natural stuff. There's just every single environmental product out there has had this really deep obsessive investment of someone trying to master this new kind of product. So that's your next stage. And then you've got the stage where you're really actively trying to influence the system. You've mastered something. Okay, well, you need to get a law change. We need to change the government. We need to get extra funding for this. Where you're really trying to change policy and having that spread through people. So if we're all just capping off at the educational awareness stage, we're not realizing that humans have all these other, almost like, is transcendental, but no, transcendent. Transcendent is the word I mean. All these other levels in them for social influence and for mastery and for taking not just a year, but like decade after decade worth of mastery into this. And I think that just that game lens can help us ask the question of how do we hatch this open in people?
Yeah, that's so true. As I'm listening to you speak there, I'm just thinking about the point at which the fall off curve as people are progressing through that journey. If you just take a random population of people and where the tipping point is, like if we could just get most people across this line, we'd move the needle. Because we don't need everybody to end up being the next green entrepreneur, right? But we need some. So like if we take a population of 1 million people, how many people do we need to get to this point? How many people do we need to get to this point? That would be really interesting to know, because that's a design objective that I feel like you could build a game toward, right? If you knew that it's a very different game to get somebody jazzed up about and teach them to be the next green entrepreneur versus to get them to remember to compost or something or turn their lights off, right?
Yeah. So we kind of need to have different products for these different people as to where they are along the stage. I did a podcast interview a couple of weeks ago about a woman who was studying the amount of self-efficacy people have to influence the people around them. She was finding that people's sense of self-efficacy, not to do the environmental thing, they're like, yeah, I have really high self-efficacy. I can plant the tree and do the compost and do all this. But what about your self-efficacy to go and get 10 people you know to do it? That's a really different thing. And that requires a lot of extroversion. It requires a lot of emotional intelligence. It requires a lot of confidence. It just requires a sense of gumption that I can go and ask some real person I know to do something, and maybe they'll say no, and then I'll feel really awkward. Really dealing with a totally different realm, but yet that ability for people to go out and talk to people around them is the most powerful way that things change. It is how people change. So it just really showed that making things or making products or campaigns or messages for people at the different levels of where they're at. We don't want to be using top 10 green tips for people that are already really deeply green. It's silly. But people that are already deeply green, trying to get them to increase their confidence and their sense of emotional support that they can go out and have those 10 awkward conversations with people to see if they want to get solar as well. That's something we're not doing, like dividing it up for those different sections of people of where they're at along the bell curve. And for those deep green people, that 1% of people that are already there, trying to encourage them to really step into their mastery. That's a tool for that particular market.
I don't know that this is game specific, but I think early on with the environmental movement, a lot of it was about information. So we want people to be informed and then they will take action. And then after that, it's kind of like, okay, well, beyond information, we need to give people the tools to actually know how to be effective proponents of whatever environmental change that they want to see. But almost, I feel like the third phase is customization. It's almost like customizing the impactful action that best aligns with whatever else in life is important to you right now as a human being. So case in point, because I just went through this for the beginning of 2023, where apropos to the conversation we had before the recording is this question of simplicity and the value of the pursuit of simplicity in one's life. And as I analyzed the structure of my life going into 2023, I decided that I wanted to simplify some things. And then dovetailing with that was this idea that one way that I can simplify is I can buy less stuff. I can refrain from hitting the buy now button on Amazon. And I can establish a set of parameters around when I will allow myself to buy something that are far stricter than they have been in the past, which I think is an aspirational change that I think a lot of people attempt to make. But if they're just trying to do it for the environmental impact and there's no connection to something has value directly into their life, in my case, it was the pursuit of a more simple life, then it's, I think, that much more difficult to get traction. So I wish there was some way that we could, when we were designing games for environmental impact, that we could, and maybe we could, is like assess where the player is at, the player in air quotes here, in terms of what else they're trying to accomplish in their life, independent of their green aspirations. And then almost matchmaking, like, oh, okay, you really care about X right now. Well, here's an environmental agenda that dovetails really nicely with the direction that you're already trying to head. It'd be so interesting to see. And I don't know that that's so much a game anymore, so much as an enormous data analysis project or like a database that connects people with the right action for where they're at in their life. But that's kind of what that made me think of.
There's a whole body of research about having one action trigger another, that the way, you form new habits is by piggybacking them on other things, although that's probably not exactly what you were saying. But yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done in tailoring these things for different groups, right? It's not unrealistic or unviable, your track of thinking, that, if somebody is really into health and they're like, well, what I'm really focusing on is health right now, that right. Then takes them to something that's far more about eating and gardening and vegan eating and that thing. And if somebody is interested in cleaning and home design and home management, I've also been on the home management thing, the Marie Kondo book, like you were mentioning.
Yeah.
And it's so much about zero waste and not being overly doing too much consumption. Marie Kondo is like the ultimate environmentalist.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of living with less. And she brings a deeper, like a spiritual dimension into it, that you should have this joyful, spiritual, deep connection and appreciation and gratitude with all of the items. And when we're just buying stuff and using too much stuff, we lose that sense of gratitude and appreciation. So there's all these higher order philosophies and dimensions that kind of come along with that stuff. But anyway, sticking on track, not going too much on the octopus tentacle of tangents, you're tailoring the user experience for what people are into. And if somebody's like really into their kids, they've got small children and they're all about kids, then it's more about children's education. It's a huge failure of that to happen. Like everything is one size fits all. You look at PG&E's energy saving stuff, like all the messages from the city, from the green groups, it's all one size fits all. And then you've got the extreme environmentalists complaining about the disaster of the top green tips, like how it's watering down the movement and how dare you have meat-free Monday. It's just enabling this. And then the other people saying on the other end, like, oh, it's way too hard. It's overwhelming. I just shut it out. Getting a sense of tailoring experiences for people is really what we need to get better at.
And as I think about it, I have designed kind of a game around I've designed a game system around this objective of buying less stuff. And I think maybe normal people don't do that. But as I think about it,
I've designed two actually, but I never made them. I designed them, but never.
And I think that structure, that system, even though it's not something that I've written down and put onto, and certainly not into digital format or even onto the format of a board game or anything like that, I think that structure is a big part of what helps me get to those dopamine moments where I feel a sense of empowerment and feel a sense of self-efficacy. I'm just imagining what it would be like to live in a world where you could have a game that, after it identified the things that you're already intrinsically motivated by, that it could create a game structure in order to tap into that motivation and turn it into a set of behaviors that stand the test of time or that have a positive impact. Because that's where I think, without those game structures, this resolution that is now, granted, we're 1 month in, right? So we'll see, check back in 6 months, but I can feel that my momentum is increasing. Whereas I think it's around this time that the typical New Year's resolution is starting to at least plateau, if not wane a little bit. And I think it's really because of that game structure that it is very much waxing. And I think there's something to that.
Wait, this game structure that you created just for yourself? Mm-hmm. What is it? What is the game structure you created for yourself?
Well, so there's rules, first of all, right? There's a rubric that I use to evaluate the prospect of a purchase. There's no extrinsic reward, but there are rewards built into the moments where I succeed at being mindful or identifying so that I would normally make as a knee-jerk reaction, but instead either don't make or file into a system that pushes it out or aligns it with some other objective. And then there are like regular check-in points. There are points where I formally sit down, I look at my performance, and I feel a sense of either excitement or disappointment in myself based on the results. And so far, it's been this positive feedback loop where each time I sit down, I find that I've done better than I was even planning, which motivates me even more to do better, to do even more the next time. So there's very much this virtual cycle, I think, at play with the structure.
And is it just like something you made up, or did you write it down? Is it just,
it's just made up
in your mind?
It's only it's all tacit. Yeah.
Yeah, but these simple little, basically like a system of rules, right? That you've created for yourself, just in your mind.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of like, trying to make deliverable stuff that people can do. I mean, you could put that in an Instagram post. Like, that's how rapidly deliverable it could be if you wanted to put that out and teach people. You can try to practice it in your own mind. You don't need to have a $2 million budget and like 10 amazing programmers and artists to bring it to fruition. Once you get a sense of what those rules are, you can put it together, and you can even use really simple softwares. Like people had to use this one called ConvertFlow. It's basically just for making sales funnel. It's a little drag and drop editor, and you can make quizzes and stuff. But you can put little tiny, very simple little interactive widgets inside a website where you could teach this and make it almost a game without it having to be this big, elaborate thing.
And then the fundamental crux of the game mechanic at its core is the satisfaction of not having more stuff, which ties into that value of simplicity. And so if you take away that value of simplicity and all you feel is the absence of the stuff that you wanted to buy, I'm not sure it would work. So that's the question, is how would you make it a one size fits all? Or maybe more to the point, can you make it a one size fits all? Or do you really have to design custom systems and reward systems in particular to tailor to what's important to the individual player? Like you mentioned, that one person competition was obviously a deep value of his. When he saw his stats compared to other people, that was highly motivating for him. I would suspect there's a whole psychological category of people for whom that mechanic is highly effective, of many others who it would probably bounce harmlessly off of. I think what I'm realizing through this whole conversation is, yeah, in a perfect world, we would have thousands of game designers designing highly custom mechanics to different psychological profiles.
Yeah, but that sounds like a crazy kind of feature creep disaster. I think if you pull the scope in of the game massively, that it's like the scope is your game is like an Instagram carousel. That's how simple it has to be. You've got to teach it. And you bring the scope in, then you can have that kind of tailoring. But I see what you mean. Like it has to be around a core value system.
Yes.
Once you've got that core value system and somebody's also committed to that value system, there's also that sense of commitment to that goal, like a goal and a value, you can almost put them together. Then you can actually have a product or whatever it is, be something very simple that it could even be like a piece of paper. I commit to blah, 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 blah. And then you write it down and that's your game, you know?
Yeah.
Do you have any special moments or memories when something really, really worked on people or kids and you saw the impact happen that you cherish?
Oh, yeah. So the game that I mentioned that I worked on for my master's thesis, which eventually became our first project with the Jason Project, which was a middle school science curriculum organization. It's called Resilient Planet. That was the name of the curriculum, and the game ended up being called Resilient Planet as well, even though it was essentially a game about ocean science. And in the game, we ask you to take on the role of a researcher, and you're trying to answer a question about population dynamics in the ocean. And we give you the same tools that the real researchers use. And we created a simulated environment and ask you to go out and use those tools in order to collect data and make scientific arguments. And when we tested the game in the classroom, I distinctly remember this one student looking at his score in the game. And in his mind, his score was a proxy for how good of an ocean scientist he was, which is so funny to think that in the span of 20 minutes, 30 minutes of gameplay, that somebody can start to form the identity of an ocean scientist and have that speaking of self-efficacy, have that sense of self-efficacy from the game. Whereas prior to that experience, I'm sure that person, 13-year-old didn't walk around thinking of himself on the spectrum of not ocean scientist to 100% ocean scientist material. And he turned to his classmate and he said that based on he was doing really well at the game, and he didn't even originally think of himself as somebody who cared about ocean science. So he was in the same breath saying that this experience had not only made him think of himself as somebody who could do ocean science, but also that prior to the experience, this was just like a completely, maybe something that he would have related with people that he saw on television, or things that felt like very distant or removed or abstract, or things that he probably frankly just never even considered within in the realm of possibility. And to have that sort of mindset transformation to not only like, oh, okay, I think I have a sense of how I would do this if I were to do it, but also I have natural aptitude and affinity here, and just like get to check both of those boxes in the span of a classroom. That was the moment where I was really hooked on the idea of learning games for impact, because I've just never seen any other technology do that. Now, did that student go on to become an ocean scientist? Doesn't really matter. From my perspective, what mattered was that we had created a technology that in a very short span of time could get somebody to have a complete shift in paradigm from average middle school student in Iowa to possible future ocean scientist. And that's a really big deal.
And how old was this boy?
I think around 12 or 13 in middle school.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And was he an outlier? Were the other kids a bit like that as well? Or was he totally different to the others?
No, I mean, not an outlier at all. Nobody who participated in that particular play test came into the experience in the context of, none of these people had self-identified as people who are interested in ocean science or science in general, or the ocean in general. They were all people who were being introduced to these career paths and these practices, these professional practices for the very first time at the outset of the experience. So from that perspective, just a very virgin audience to this subject area. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges with games for impact, or really anything oriented toward impact, is like, how do you take somebody from off the street who doesn't have knowledge about something or affinity about something towards something or a value system around something or a sense of self-efficacy around something, and how do you efficiently instill that through one experience? And that's essentially the process that we took that group of kids through that day, and consistently saw levels of engagement did vary from one student to the next, but I would say we definitely had the majority, something like 80+% of the class walking away from the experience, having put on the lens of ocean science and having viewed the world through that lens, realizing that A, it was maybe an interesting practice that they hadn't thought about previously, but B, that it was something that they were actually fully capable of doing should they decide to pursue it at some point in their lives, or something similar for that matter.
So you kind of cracked the code on how to hatch open that intrinsic motivation and passion for the subject through this first game experiment that you ran.
That's certainly what it felt like to me.
Yeah. Well, what I'm really getting out of this conversation is there's a constant divide between education design, or I'm constantly working to articulate the difference between what is education design and what is action design, that they're both so different. And what I've really gotten out of this conversation is just how powerful games, and when you can really drive into the complexity, the creativity, the story, and especially this mastery, you're hatching open, you're encouraging this intrinsic motivation, that intrinsic power inside people, that then when they go out into the world, they'll do stuff. But we don't necessarily design the game to get people to put the thing in the right bin. We design to really create this inner transformation, like you just shared what happened with these kids playing this ocean scientist game.
That's exactly right. And you never know what is going to trigger that aha moment, right? I mean, that's why we call the company Filament. It's now a little bit anachronistic, but the filament inside of the light bulb being the iconic representation of that aha moment where you have a paradigm shift, or you take on a new perspective, or you get excited about something that you didn't previously care about, right? Those transformational shifts are the ingredients of impact from my perspective. With each individual person, you never know what collection of ingredients is going to produce the ultimate desired behavior. But I feel like what's so rewarding about the craft of impact game design is that we're constantly working to try to create more ingredients for more people. And sometimes, I feel like we have win scenarios like I described. Sometimes it feels like it doesn't work very well, and there's a lot of instances that are somewhere in between. But I feel like it's the good fight. It's a proverbial good fight, right? It's like the pursuit of knowledge about how you deliver experiences to people that transform them towards some positive direction. That's just incredibly fulfilling. And I feel like there are many lifetimes of learning to be done in terms of how to master that and perfect it.
It feels like we're only just scratching the surface in this space. And final question, what are you specifically most interested in exploring in these games for impact in the next 10 years? Do you have a little chestnut of one thing that you really want your own mastery that you really want to crack?
And this one's pretty easy for me right now because I'm so steeped in the space of robotics, which I know isn't directly related to environmental impact, but I would say tangentially, just because I feel like solving big, hairy environmental issues is partially about social movements and about political movements and about changing policy and changing behavior. But there is also the prospect of technological solutions as well. And that's where I think STEM and robotics in particular really plays in heavily. But the reason why I'm personally so jazzed up about robotics education right now, besides the fact that it's kind of this STEM superfood, when I say STEM, I mean science, technology, engineering, and math, is just that as I look at the future landscape of A, big challenging problems for humanity to solve, B, really interesting, meaningful, rewarding career paths, and C, things that games can do a uniquely amazing job at teaching that other media are really not up to, robotics just like checks all of those boxes. And even if we get somebody excited about robotics and they don't actually become a roboticist or a STEM professional, the types of thinking that you do in robotics is highly transferable to all sorts of other really important problem solving disciplines, which, let's face it, at the end of the day, most of us, when we leave school, become professional problem solvers. We just solve all sorts of different shapes and sizes of problems. And so I think that mindset is a really good one to indoctrinate people into. So yeah, that's what this work that we're doing on RoboCo, which is a game to teach robotics, where you're building robots to solve problems, is the thing that I can see myself sinking. We've been working on it for 5 years, and I can definitely see myself putting another 5 years into this space, because I think if we get more people excited about robotics, I think we really will have a significant positive impact both on those people and on the world in general.
Yeah, and it's true. You need to be able to do complex problem solving to solve any of these problems. And there is not one single environmental issue that isn't largely technical. It's social and political as well, but they all have a technical basis. Yes. Just to be able to exercise that part of your brain that can actually like problem solve, which not everybody can do, right? Some people are good at following instructions, but they're not great at problem solving something that hasn't been done before.
Well, school doesn't prepare us well to think about completely open-ended problem spaces either. Problem spaces where there are literally infinite viable solutions, some obviously more elegant than others. It's usually there are 4 options and one of them is right? And
that is where the divergent octopus brain finds its true genius, that you can get into a problem and you're like this, that, and that. Really finds its genius, trying to work in a focused way towards a goal. Not always. We were just talking about the tendency to constantly diverge with new ideas.
Way to bring it full circle.
Problem solving. Well, this was awesome, Dan. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the podcast. You have such a wealth of experience and insight into this craft that you have about games through impact. And there's definitely a lot of interest there in the climate and environmental space to get better at games, and the word gamification that no one in the game industry likes, but climate folks do tend to like it. That we can start to bring this interaction design into the social change movements, so we can actually get the kind of traction that we want to see. So thanks so much for joining. Is there anything you wanted to add before we go about any projects that you want to promote, ways people can follow you? They can follow Filament Games, anything like that?
Yeah, so Filament Games, our website, filamentgames.com, RoboCo is roboco.co. Please always encourage people to follow us on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, all the different social medias. We're there. You can find us. TikTok, we're on them all. And we'd love to connect with you.